Hello and welcome to this presentation, this webinar on ADHD implications and information for Queensland teachers in the vet sector. My name is Natasha and I am currently teaching for TAFE Queensland, teaching within an adult literacy and numeracy program. This first slide, the image shows a picture of me actually with some children. I was teaching a yoga class too. And for me, this image shows and represents the diversity amongst us. So here you can see diversity of the size and shape of our feet, the color of our skin. And it leads me to introduce to you, perhaps for the first time, the concept of neurodiversity. It's a concept that's been around for a while, but in a nutshell, it means that the brain differences are just that, differences. So conditions like ADHD and autism and dyslexia, etc., aren't or shouldn't be seen as abnormal. They're simply variations and diverse representations of the human brain. So moving on, I'd like to give you a definition of dyslexia, sorry, not dyslexia, of ADHD. ADHD is an abbreviation for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It is a developmental disorder, a neurodevelopmental disorder that typically begins in childhood. ADD, as it was formerly referred to and sometimes still is, ADD refers to attention deficit disorder. Typically, this condition begins in childhood, although it may not be diagnosed until adulthood. Children and adolescents and adults with ADHD have characteristic behaviors such as difficulties with concentration, attention, and impulse control, which can impact their day-to-day life. So everything from learning and schooling to their social life. Prevalence rates in Australia are around 1 in 20 Australians has ADHD. It's believed to be more common in boys. Around 2 to 3% of adults are diagnosed with ADHD. And while it is typically, as I mentioned, it does begin in childhood and typically symptoms can improve with management as children get older. The DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, so the 5th edition, so that's the current edition, defines ADHD symptoms as a persistent pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity, impulsivity that interferes with functioning or development that is inconsistent with the developmental level and that negatively impacts directly on social and academic occupational outcomes. So implications for teachers really as ADHD affects the brain's executive functioning, we would see in our students with ADHD that they would have impairments in their ability to self-regulate and to control thoughts and words and actions and emotions. It's typically categorized into 3 different categories. So there's the inattentive type, the hyperactive type, and then the combined type. So as for the legal obligations and policies, registered training organisations such as TAFE Queensland are required to comply with the standards for registered training organisations, for RTOs. We're required to comply with the Disability Discrimination Act of 1992. So we, as teachers, as teaching professionals, have both legal and professional obligations to make reasonable adjustments to ensure that students with a disability, learning difficulties, are able to access information on the same basis as their peers. So it is our responsibility as educators to make these reasonable adjustments within a reasonable time frame, and making those adjustments to a student's learning program. Or it might be making adjustments to the physical environment or the provision of additional support so that we can therefore assist our students to fulfill their potential. There is a clause, if you like, an exemption, which is known as unjustifiable hardship. This exemption or exception rather allows an education provider the right to refuse to make reasonable adjustment if it's going to create unjustifiable hardship to the school or the education provider, or to the majority of students within that educational setting, such as the adjustment might incur a high cost, or pose some risks or harm to other students. As education providers, we are required to consider all resources available to them when we're planning for students in our care. I will, at the end of this webinar, include some links for you to access the ASQA fact sheet and the TAFE Queensland Student Support Policy, as well as a link to the Disability Standards for Education. Oh, so moving on, causes of ADHD. So the causes of ADHD are still being researched and debated. Across my reading and research, I came across some information that suggested that ADHD is currently one of the most researched neurobiological developmental disorders in the world. Now, I'm inclined to believe that would be because there is some decent profit involved in treatment. That's the skeptic in me. But there does exist some controversies in regards to the various treatments available. But it's really only with ongoing and extensive and continued research that we'll begin to understand more about this condition. So while currently researchers disagree on the exact causes of ADHD, there is agreement that the causes are complex, they're complicated. The domains of research currently exist within two domains. So the first is biological, which I'll discuss here. And on the next slide, I will talk with you about the environmental causes of the condition of ADHD. So biological factors and causes. Genetic studies show that ADHD is a highly heritable disorder. So it runs in families. And in most cases, it's thought that the genes you inherit from your parents are a significant factor in developing the condition. Neurobiological abnormalities. So research has identified a number of possible differences in the brains with people with ADHD, comparative to those without the condition. Again, although the exact significance of these differences is not clear. Research has focused on neurotransmitters, so that's the little chemical messengers within the brain. And there is research to suggest that the ADHD brain has an imbalance in the or there's at least an association of an imbalance of neurotransmitters. Research has also focused on birth trauma. And there are certain groups of people who are believed to be more at risk of ADHD. So this includes people who were born prematurely. So that is before the 37th week of pregnancy, or born with a low birth weight. People who have epilepsy or have some kinds of brain damage. They have incurred damage to their brain, which happens either in the womb or after birth, a severe head injury later in life. So behavioral and environmental factors. So it is thought that both the genetic and environmental factors can interact to cause these changes in the brain development and functioning. What I forgot to mention on the previous slide, and I'll just flick back to that, is that a lot of the interesting research that's coming from ADHD at the moment comes from the information that we can gain from brain scanning. So particularly functional brain scanning that can look at the brain in real time while the person is performing some tasks of attention. So this research is really trying to identify and pinpoint the specific regions of the brain and the certain aspects of the neurophysiology that's involved in creating the symptoms of ADHD. So back to the environmental and behavioral causes. So there has been a lot of myths, I guess, about ADHD. And one of the myths is that poor parenting can lead to ADHD. There is no evidence that poor or negligent parenting can lead to the condition, nor that the condition is caused by eating sugar or watching too much TV or traumatic experiences. So that comes from ADHD Australia. Having said that, it is believed that children with the condition of ADHD would benefit from the support of informed parents and health professionals. So there is a range of suggestions that dietary factors or certain nutritional deficiencies can impact the ADHD, the severity of the symptoms. And again, there's no evidence that these cause ADHD. Certainly the family, the family environment and the parenting and attachment style is believed to, again, have an impact on the ADHD, the person with ADHD's behavior. So continuing on here, I wanted to talk to you about comorbidities. So the term comorbid or comorbidity simply means that there is an overlap of symptoms. So it's important to note that these specific learning difficulties, these are conditions such as dyslexia, dyspraxia, also ADHD and dyscalculia. They exist on a continuum or a spectrum. There's a very famous report that came out of the UK called the Rose Report, which says that dyslexia is identifiable as a developmental difficulty of language, learning, and cognition. And key characteristics of the condition are identified as difficulties in phonological awareness, verbal memory, and verbal processing speed. So that is for dyslexia. I'd like to point out again, bearing in mind that term of neurodiversity I brought up right at the beginning of this presentation, I really believe that it's very important that we as educators focus on the core issues or the core concerns rather than focusing on a specific label such as ADHD, ADD, dyslexia, dyspraxia. What I am trying to show here on this slide that essentially there is an overlap of symptoms with ADHD and other conditions which impact learning. And if we are to focus on supporting our students with ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, etc., we should really focus on the shared concerns, those sort of overlap of symptoms, such as I have in the bottom box there, attention difficulties. How can we help them with that? How can we support our students with their memory problems? What kind of tasks and activities can we do to support them to address those struggles? Organizational difficulties. So people with ADHD often have difficulty with planning and organization, as do learners with dyslexia and dyspraxia, etc. And then processing difficulties. So processing difficulties includes both the speed and the depth of processing. And I would like to reference again this visual representation of the overlap of these conditions, dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, dyscalculia, and how they often have shared symptoms. So as we are in TAFE Queensland and working mostly with adults, it should be noted that the majority of adults with ADHD have a diagnosed or undiagnosed comorbid psychiatric disorder, which can further complicate the diagnosis and treatment of ADHD. So these would be things like depression and anxiety, mood disorders, ODD, and CD. So ODD is oppositional defiance disorder, which again is listed in the DSM-5, and CD is conduct disorder. And I won't go into details with that one right now. So continuing on and just explaining the implications for a person with ADHD on their the social impact on ADHD. So firstly, family, once a child or an adolescent is diagnosed with a condition such as ADHD, the family and siblings, grandparents can experience a sense of sadness or loss or worry, and to some degree, grief. There can be some marital stress from perhaps disagreements of different parenting styles and different methods of managing the condition, both within the home and then trying to support their child through their educational journey. So the family can also experience, aside from the stress and tension and guilt, perhaps disappointment that I've mentioned, a series of financial costs and stresses. There can be a struggle with accessing, first of all, the practitioners, the medical health professionals or psychologists who would provide the initial diagnosis, and the time in accessing referral and seeking referral after referral. And then once a diagnosis has been made after, the positive testing for ADHD has been attained, there can be more time, which can create more stress in trying to seek support and assistance for their child. So there can be significant impacts on the family, particularly when the child with ADHD has quite severe symptoms, as a behavioral symptoms I'm talking about. So the students that would be diagnosed are usually the ones who have the most extreme or most severe behavioral symptoms. So going back to the individual with the diagnosis, we know that the students with learning difficulties or conditions which impact learning, such as ADHD, have been found to be more vulnerable to rejection and bullying. And this vulnerability can lead them to have psychosocial problems and difficulties in their development, of their social development and their emotional development. They might have feelings of discouragement within themselves, a poor or low sense of self-worth. A student with ADHD or other learning difficulties such as dyslexia can develop a sense of learned helplessness. So this is a term where the student begins to lack that feeling and that sense of agency, and can essentially give up on the idea of their own success. They can have very low expectations of success, and suffer from feelings of inadequacy and hopelessness. Some students with ADHD may become at risk of internalized disorders such as eating problems, eating disorders, or unhealthy eating habits. They may self-harm or self-medicate using alcohol and other drugs, and can have substance abuse or depression, and at worst can lead to addiction and death. So continuing on with the social impact, the most important point to remind you is that when providing support to students with developmental disorders which impact learning, such as ADHD, to see them as a person, to treat them with respect, not to treat them as a person with autism or with dyslexia or with ADHD. People with ADHD often feel quite humiliated, as they genuinely have difficulties staying focused, being attentive, or controlling their impulses. So they have that impulse control difficulty. It's widely accepted that young people with ADHD have issues with self-esteem, and can often experience bullying, which can lead to, again, the feelings of depression and sadness, and can lead to other mental health conditions, and suicidal thoughts. So teaching strategies, classroom environment, what can we do as educators in the VET sector? How can we support our students with ADHD? Again, I'd like to remind you that instead of regarding these students as suffering from a deficit or a disease or a dysfunction, if we can keep in mind the term and the concept of neurodiversity, we can start to focus on their strengths. Perhaps one of the most important tools that we can use to help build a positive approach to life and a positive niche for the neurodiverse brain is to have our own understanding of each student's strengths. So I know in our classroom we do issue a strengths test, online strengths test for our students, and we try to remind them of their strengths. So really this idea of neurodiversity can be quite a paradigm shift in how we think about students with learning difficulties. And instead of regarding them as suffering from a deficit or disease or dysfunction, we can speak about their strengths and even discuss brain diversity using the same kind of language, the same kind of discourse that we would employ if we talked about biodiversity and cultural diversity. So practically, as students with ADHD might have difficulties with attending to a task, their depth of processing, their speed of processing, It's important as teachers that we try to avoid distractions, so a lot of movement in the class. If you can, don't have your student with ADHD to sit near a window or a door where they can get pulled off task from movement. And where possible, avoid confrontational situations. Of course, that's often beyond our control, but to try to minimize and reduce that. Keeping our instructions to a minimum, again, to support the students' short-term memory struggles and ability to stay focused and attentive. We need to ensure that we have a clear structure within the class. So it's predictable, it has routine. Helping a young person with their planning and organizational skills is not only going to support them in their learning journey within an educational environment, but certainly will help them in all aspects of their life. So finding ways to help your student to plan and to organize. Students with ADHD will often need to have the opportunity to discharge their energy. So they might need to move or even leave the room periodically so that they can help that can help them to stay focused and on task. It's recommended to avoid open plan classrooms or to even sit a student close to the teacher. I have an image here of these corrals, which it's been suggested that this would be a sort of an ideal classroom setup for students with attention difficulties. And to make sure that we're always setting achievable and realistic standards and expectations, to trying to set our students up for success, and making sure that we're giving frequent feedback, we're reassuring our students and helping them along the way. Preference-based teaching is a style of teaching whereby you identify the student's preference for learning. I know, again, in our program, we do this right at the beginning of a student's learning journey with us, where we try to ascertain that student's specific learning style. So focusing on the student's learning style, be it visual, auditory, kinesthetic, etc., and to try to really utilize that in their learning. It's also important to have and cultivate and build a healthy rapport with the student to increase the enjoyment of their learning. Although really these 2 points of focusing and utilizing the student's learning style and building teacher-student rapport, this could be said for all students, not just students with learning difficulties such as ADHD. Students with ADHD need help with their thinking process. So again, giving structure is really important. They may tire quite easily and have difficulty with pacing the progress of their work. So just, again, don't have high expectations of high volume of output for the students. Break their tasks down into small, achievable tasks, giving clear structure and providing support along the way. So wrapping up now, here are some web links that I encourage you to access. I've also provided you with a handout where there is more detailed information and reference and links for you to learn more about our beloved students with ADHD. And I hope that you will take the time to read the information contained within that brochure and do your best to help our students with these learning difficulties such as ADHD. If nothing else, my take home, I guess, is for you to remember the term neurodiversity, and to help try create a strengths-based classroom where students with all sorts of labels can merge together, to learn together, to meet as equals, and to form this new type of learning environment. Thank you so much for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day or evening.